Welcome back to Outside the System. Today's episode is with entrepreneur and writer Michael Ruiz. Michael and I connected during the pandemic, and he's been an outside the system thinker since I've known him. While he's a Bitcoin proponent, he raised concerns years ago about the lack of a circular economy and capture by large financial firms, which goes against the core freedom money ethic of Bitcoin. After El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender, he ended up visiting and is now moving to the country while building multiple businesses. He shared this journey in detail during the episode. If you enjoyed this episode, you can send us a boost on Fountain or any other app that supports podcasting 2.0. Leaving a review and sharing on social media are also great ways to support the show. Without further ado, here's my discussion with Michael. Enjoy. Michael, it's long overdue. Welcome to Outside the System.
Hey, thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me here.
We've been talking for a couple of years. I think I came across you on social media, must have been maybe even during 2020, during the pandemic. I resonated with a lot of things you were talking about. We're going to get into some of that. But I think the best place to start is most recently you've been in El Salvador. And I want to talk about that a lot. It's been hoping to get someone on the podcast who's very knowledgeable and, you're actually on the ground. So first of all, what's happening in El Salvador? Why is everyone talking about it? It seems to be the talk of the world right now, especially the Bitcoin world. Tell us a little bit about what's happening.
Well, I think the best way to get into this is kind of start with how I discovered El Salvador, and that might shed some light on what's happening over there. So I went there originally in December to just basically take a trip. I needed to meet up with a buddy, and we decided that El Salvador was a place to meet. And during that trip, we recorded some content. We wanted to document what was happening with Bitcoin over there. And, a few days into it, we realized that Bitcoin isn't a story. As we started talking to locals, as we started talking to business owners, what really was a story over there was the transformation that has occurred under Bukele's leadership. And so we pivoted during that little trip from, telling the Bitcoin story over there to telling the story of El Salvador and the transformation that's occurred. We talked to, like I said, local business owners and to just people in general. And what we found out was that, prior to Bukele, life was really hard over there. They lived under constant oppression, under the gangs, and feared for their life basically every day. And it was almost, I would equate it to a parallel government operating in El Salvador. And so they were living under tyranny. And when Bukele came in and created that initiative to get rid of the gangs, literally liberated the country. And the people are just absolutely amazing. And the country is absolutely beautiful. So during that trip, I really fell in love with the country and decided that 10 days wasn't enough, that I needed to go back and take a closer look for a longer period of time. So I took another trip 2 weeks later to El Salvador, this time for a month. And I just observed and saw what was happening over there. I also got a chance to interact with the local Bitcoin community, as well as just live life as an El Salvadoran would over there. And what I felt was just magic, right? First of all, El Salvador, because it's adopted Bitcoin and because it's created a foundation built on traditional values, is attracting a very special type of expat, right? This isn't someone who's looking to escape the rat race and just drink margaritas on the beach. It's attracting what I would refer to as sovereign individuals, people that want to go over there, want to live a life that's aligned with their values on a Bitcoin standard, and that want to build. And, these people are interesting. and they're driven and they're motivated and they're inspiring and they're everywhere. And so you go to these meetups and you have conversations, and these aren't conversations that you just, you would have casually anywhere else in the world. So it's acting as a magnet, I think, for the best and brightest minds. And so I really became inspired by that. And I started looking for opportunities, a way to enter El Salvador and immediately provide value, and just started discussing that desire online, and found other people interested as well in building in El Salvador. And so that's really what brought me to the country. Since then, I've made probably 6 trips over there in the past 6 months. Now, I finally decided that this is where I'm going to build a new life in El Salvador and see what the future holds.
That's awesome. Actually, your point on expats brings up a thought I've had actually for a while about the U.S. I think the U.S. used to be that kind of a place, right? It attracted the best and brightest. Like I'm of Indian origin. I'm born in the U.S., but my parents are from India, and it's like people have this stereotype like Indians are smart. No, Indians are not smart as a race. It's like we're just the people who ended up in the U.S. were just the ones that wanted to work hard, get ahead. The U.S. is a way better country if you're ambitious than India is, at least historically it was. Maybe now it may not be the same. But at least, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you wanted to get ahead. You're not going to do that in India. You're going to do that in the U.S. India was a quasi-communist country at that point. So there's no way you're getting ahead. But in the U.S., you had that opportunity if you were willing to work hard. And, it kind of feels like a similar story at play in El Salvador with kind of what they've created. And I have some, questions we'll get into there. But it does seem like they're trying to attract a very specific type of individual who, values their sovereignty, wants to build, make a better world. And I think that's like kind of the recipe for success for a nation. So that's really interesting to see. What is so I listened to Bukele's.
I got something to that
ahead.
If I could. So
sure,
similar to you,
absolutely.
My father is from Honduras, and he came to America for a better life, for more opportunity to live out the American dream. And I think that dream is very much alive in El Salvador, right? Where America over the past 50 years has gone a different route. El Salvador has, I think, decided to revive the American dream, this idea of freedom, liberty, property rights, entrepreneurship, right? All of this is embedded now into the foundation of El Salvador. And I think, that is putting a call out to the world that, hey, the American dream actually exists also in El Salvador. So it's kind of funny. My dad came from Honduras to the United States, and Honduras is just a bordering country to El Salvador. And now his son is going back over there and to find his opportunity and live out the American dream.
That's amazing, like full circle story. I do wonder, and this I was going to ask this much later in the episode. You brought it up with the Honduras thing. Like, I wonder how many other countries will look at this model and say, hey, there's like they're doing something right. We should probably try to replicate that. Like, I wonder how much of a domino effect this could have, with other countries trying to emulate.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that I've always thought was going to happen. I remember as soon as El Salvador announced that they were adopting Bitcoin as legal tender, I think a week later, I wrote an article on Substack where I said El Salvador is the new Venice, basically a play on words from Bitcoin is the new Venice, that article written by Alan Farrington. But the idea there is that, there's going to be a renaissance that occurs in El Salvador, and it's going to be an example for the rest of the world to see and to follow as the country adopts sound money and, embraces traditional values and just, really common sense approach to governing a country in order to create prosperity for their citizens. I think that the rest of the world is going to notice that as El Salvador thrives, and we already are seeing it, I think, happen. Bukele just got inaugurated again for a second term. And immediately after that, you heard about other Latin American countries following his initiative, especially in reducing crime and gang violence in their countries and creating a safe and stable foundation for people to live their lives and build businesses on. So I think we're already starting to see that effect, and I think it's only going to continue.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing, like, it's interesting because, I mean, El Salvador is doing, and we should talk about this too, the Bitcoin mining with the volcano. There's other countries doing that as well since El Salvador started doing that. Like, I didn't know this. I was listening to a episode on, actually, we were just talking about this before we hit record, Adventure Capitalists podcast, which is pretty interesting. They did an episode on Bitcoin mining around the world using excess energy or stranded energy. And so Iceland is doing it. Kenya is doing it. I think Nigeria is doing it. Ethiopia is doing it. Uganda is doing it. Like, there's actually a lot of countries that are seeing the opportunity and saying, hey, this is actually interesting. There's excess energy here we're not using. This is actually a really good form of value or currency. We should be doing this. Like, why aren't we doing this? Why isn't the United States doing this? Like, it just seems like a no-brainer. But I think you will see, I mean, you're starting to see, hopefully, a little bit of the dominoes falling a little bit, where people are seeing what El Salvador has done and at least taking baby steps into, maybe trying it out for themselves. Part of it too is, I think some of these countries are some are more, some are less under the U.S. thumb, and they probably don't want to, annoy the U.S. And so there's a little bit of, geopolitics probably being played as well.
Go
ahead. Yep.
Sorry. One of the things I think we've seen over the past, 50 years to, 100 years is kind of the centralization of power under this one hegemony.
Yep.
Right. And I think that's being unwound now. And, Bitcoin is a big part of that. And it's just going to take time. A lot of these intertanglements still exist. But, as one empire falls and another one gets built up, hopefully a decentralized empire, right? I think that we're going to see these kind of old alliances and power structures start to, unwind. And it's just going to take time.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll link to the Adventure Capitalist episode in the show notes. One of the logic points they were bringing up for why a country would even get into Bitcoin mining like this is, what traditionally happened is, let's say you're a country, small country, you have an energy source, but you don't have the capability to build the infrastructure around that energy source. You got to, let's say it's oil, you got to get it out of the ground, you got to get it to a port. You got to refine it or get it to a refinery. So there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be built. So what used to happen is a multinational company, which obviously has the sponsorship of effectively the US, or at least somebody in the US, even if it's, BP, it's still under the US hegemony, as you're talking about, even though it's a UK company. They come in, they say, hey, we'll build you the infrastructure. We'll basically pay you like a small royalty on the oil that is in your country. And so what these guys were talking about in the podcast was, with Bitcoin, actually, if you can take that energy, use it at the source, mine Bitcoin, all you really need is an internet connection and miners. So you can tell the international company, hey, by the way, we don't want the infrastructure. We're just going to use this to mine Bitcoin. You can even sell it at the spot market once you mine it and drive immediate value instead of getting like a $2 a barrel royalty from BP. You can just mine Bitcoin and actually sell it on the open market and just immediately drive, if you want, or just hold it as reserve currency, and drive immediate value without needing to be under the thumb of a multinational or being part of this international hegemony. So pretty interesting times that this is creating.
Bitcoin is a new paradigm, and it just takes time for people to understand that, right? Like, I would imagine a lot of these energy producers are skeptical, and they just need to be educated and probably see proof of concept. And I think that we're starting to see that around the world, starting with El Salvador and its volcano mining.
Yep. So one thing I wanted to talk about and shift to a little bit is I listened to Bukele's interview with Tucker Carlson, which is fascinating. I think anyone should listen to it, especially if you have no interest in Bitcoin, because he didn't even mention Bitcoin in that interview. They didn't even talk about that. They primarily talked about crime and safety. And so I didn't know this. I did not know El Salvador was the most dangerous country on the earth until, very recently. So how has that felt on the ground? Like, does it feel very safe? I mean, you lived in the US before, you've spent a lot of time. Like, what does El Salvador feel like on the ground from a safety perspective and a day-to-day perspective?
Yeah. So similar to you, right? I heard about El Salvador and the crime, but it wasn't until I got to El Salvador and started actually talking to the locals over there that I realized just how bad and oppressive it was. Going back to my story of how I entered that country, right? And so I learned firsthand from actually talking to the people, hearing their stories, and those stories are tragic, a lot of them, and scary. I couldn't imagine living like that. And being there now, it's hard to imagine how it was because it's so safe. Like, I've never felt unsafe yet in that country, even getting lost in the city. Obviously, like any place in the world, you got to be smart and you got to be somewhat aware.
Yeah.
But in general, I've never felt unsafe. And I think a lot of that has to do with, people realizing that if they commit crimes, if they venture outside the law, that there are harsh penalties. And, Bukele makes a big show when people, commit these crimes. Right? He definitely puts it on display that they're not playing around. One of the incidences, I think there was a murder or a couple murders, and they were looking for two guys in a town, and he sent 5,000 police officers and military forces out there to capture them, right? For two guys, and it's quite a scene because they zoom into these guys and then they zoom out, and you just see the entire military force behind them. So I think a lot of people understand that the way it was back in the day is not the way it's going to be in the future, and so I think that's a big deterrent. So
the opposite of the New York City approach to crime. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So to answer your question, it feels very safe out there. I see tourists, I see expats everywhere. I've gotten lost in the city. And I've never once felt like I was in danger. In fact, Salvadoran people are very helpful, very nice. And it's amazing to be in a culture like that. They feel very cooperative. Like, I mean, I don't speak the best Spanish, but I've never had a problem over there. And people go out of their way to help you in whatever you're trying to do. It's actually pretty amazing to experience. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Bukele said something in that interview. I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of, if people don't have safety, they can't think about businesses and family and, all of the things that you build a civilization on top of. So kind of the base layer has to be people feel physically safe in that country. And until you solve that, you can't really do anything else. And I don't know, maybe this is prior to your time in El Salvador, but curious if you learned this on the ground. Like, did he solve the safety problem first and then kind of move on to Bitcoin as being, not move on to Bitcoin? Safety is kind of a constant thing, but was that kind of his priority one, and then the sort of reserve currency side happened, or were those done in parallel?
I think the plan to, the initiative to go after the gangs and to make the country safe was always kind of his platform. And then I think that, he discovered Bitcoin along the way, and they almost happened kind of simultaneously from what I understand. But like I said, Bitcoin adoption there is not really the big story yet. The big story was, just the foundation of safety that he's created around the country. And I agree with what you said. What's happening in El Salvador has kind of challenged my libertarian and anarchist kind of philosophical roots. But I definitely do see safety being a major foundation of a society, of a prosperous society. And without that, you have no certainty, right? You have no stability. And how can you build when, you have a destructive force out there that's willing to, loot and plunder you? And, this time it's not necessarily coming from the government, it's coming from the gangs. So, yeah, I absolutely now believe that, doing what you have to do in order to create safety for your country is a very vital and important part to creating a prosperous society.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts on this because I come from the same origins, like that libertarian type of philosophy, and it's challenged mine as well, like the past several years. I think part of it, but both of us kind of being from the US, like part of it is we just assumed, I think, the safety part for so long. Like the US is relatively safe, historically compared to a lot of other, countries that have struggled with more gang violence and, even wars that directly hit their soil and stuff. And I think a lot of it is like a spectrum, right? It's like we were drawn to the libertarian philosophy because probably the US was too much on the statist side, right? And then, you probably, if you go to like a true lawless place, you will say, okay, well, we need some order out here. Like this is too much. You can't build. So there's probably like, the problem is everybody would disagree on what the happy middle ground is, but I think there has to be like, I've come along like I've changed my thoughts on this as well. Like I think you do need like a base layer of safety to get anyone to invest in the future, because, we talk a lot in Bitcoin, long time horizons, and, that's like a huge part of the Bitcoin philosophy. You can't have long time horizons if you might get murdered the next day, or you might get robbed the second you leave your house. Like it's very hard to think long term if that's your day-to-day reality.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're just living in survival mode. And so when you're in survival mode, it's hard to invest in anything for the future.
Totally. So I guess next logical question is, are people using Bitcoin on the ground? Like what is the actual Bitcoin usage? Not stats and stuff, but just from somebody who's actually been on the ground, like day to day. Is it like, I mean, I know it's legal tender, but is it like people actually using it? Is it like a couple people, a few people using it? Is it pretty common? Like how has that actually been used day to day on the ground?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are absolutely communities out there that use Bitcoin on a daily basis and prefer to transact in Bitcoin. But in general, right, these are expats and people that have come to El Salvador because Bukele has basically planted the flag as this being the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. So naturally, you're going to get all this outside interest coming there in order to use it as legal tender. And so those communities have definitely sprouted up. But in general, the El Salvadoran people, they still, are skeptical, I think, of Bitcoin. And it's not accepted everywhere. In fact, I would say that in most places, right, it's not accepted, or not because they don't want to, but just because it's so rare that people come in there to pay with Bitcoin because the rest of the population hasn't adopted it. But I see all of that changing over time, right? Bitcoin, like I said, is a new paradigm. New paradigms take time to play out for people to come around and accept the ideas that exist within that paradigm. And so I think that, as more Bitcoiners move to El Salvador, it's just naturally going to create an incentive for El Salvadoran people to accept Bitcoin as currency. And also as new services around Bitcoin get built out, especially in the banking sector and in the financial sector over there, there's going to be more use cases, right, for Bitcoin as money. And so I think that naturally that's just going to spread and it's going to increase adoption. But, could you go to a grocery store and pay for your stuff in Bitcoin? It depends. I would say it all depends, right? There's some businesses and shops that have embraced Bitcoin and accept it, but, they're far and few between. But like I said, I think that's going to change.
Yeah, I think the tools part is really interesting because like as a consumer, you may not want to spend Bitcoin, but as a business owner, you might want to, keep some of your money in Bitcoin, or you might want to take Bitcoin. So there's probably a service that can do I want to pay in cash, fiat, and I want to receive Bitcoin on the business owner side. Actually, Square is doing that in the US. They launched a tool where a business owner, who uses Square, someone can pay in dollars, and then the business owner can get Bitcoin on the other end of it. So they're building, there are tools being built, and I think it's very early days of adoption of that. But, I think, think what you want, I guess, about Michael Saylor. There's a lot of pros, cons, whatever. But I have heard, there is a little bit of I would say, spillover effect of even private companies that I know, smaller companies, they actually are keeping some of their cash on hand in Bitcoin now, which is, really interesting. They're doing it for inflation risk. They're doing it for other reasons, philosophical reasons. But it's interesting, they've pioneered this model where it's more acceptable to keep some of your corporate cash in Bitcoin. And, I think the tools that could be built for that are really interesting. There's probably a lot of opportunity, frankly, in El Salvador around that, because the US, the problem has always been, if you do that conversion, it's a taxable event. In El Salvador, I think, tell me if this is wrong or if I think Bukele made some very favorable tax rules around Bitcoin where it's not, that type of conversion is not treated as a capital gain.
Yeah, and I don't know so much if that's a specific law or that just comes with Bitcoin being legal tender, right? Because, if it's legal tender. I think that is the case. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. Because you don't pay a conversion when you split a 20 into, 4 5s. You don't pay a capital gain on that. So I think you're right. Like, it's probably because of legal tender law.
Yeah. And so, I think, again, there's so many initiatives happening in El Salvador to educate people on, the value proposition surrounding Bitcoin. One of them that being a sound store of value, and also the fact that it's legal tender. And as Bitcoin rises in price, they don't have to pay capital gain. So all of this stuff needs to, make its way through the population through education initiatives, and they are. And it's just like, I very much see El Salvador kind of like a startup society, where Bukele is enacting really, I wouldn't call them radical, but they're radical against what we've traditionally known from nation states, right? And so, especially in El Salvador, where they've been used to a government that probably wasn't as forward thinking. In fact, maybe perhaps a very corrupt government in the past. And so it just takes time to become acclimated to these new initiatives. And yeah, I do see that in the future, the El Salvadoran people are really going to benefit from that country adopting Bitcoin because of, all the advantages that come with it. And one of them, including the fact that they can now save in a currency that, we all think is going to appreciate over time, and then not have to pay any capital gains on it. They could just use it as currency in their local economy, which is currently getting built out. So, yeah. And like I said, just going to take time.
So this idea of the currency appreciating over time, I know I've felt this, like, philosophically, I very much believe like we need a Bitcoin circular economy. Like, I should be able to pay for goods and services with Bitcoin. I should be able to accept Bitcoin as payment. If somebody wants to do an ad on this podcast, I should be able to send them an invoice. They pay me in Bitcoin. And obviously there's ways to do that. And there's, people that do that today. One thing that I've noticed with my own behavior and in talking to other Bitcoiners, I've noticed similar behavior. It's like, I philosophically believe that, but then I am very averse to spending my Bitcoin, right? Like, I'm like, oh, I'd rather just hold my Bitcoin. I'd rather just spend my fiat, right? And like, it's kind of like, that's the lower tier currency in my mind, right? So it's like, there's these counterbalancing forces at work. Have people started saving in Bitcoin? Because that's one thing I have seen a lot of people do, even in the US. Like, in the past, they might put, $5,000, a month or $10,000 in a year into their savings account. Now they might, put 25% of that in the savings account, 75% of it, they'll buy dollar cost average into Bitcoin, as their savings vehicle, basically. Is that something that people are doing on the ground, or is it kind of not to that level yet?
I don't think it's at that level yet. I think it's gonna, like I said, I think it's gonna get there. But again, Bitcoin's price volatility is scary for people that are not used to it, right? So
and people that don't
Bitcoiners,
have a cushion, right? It's like if you're not
exactly.
a rich country, right, you don't have any kind of cushion. Yeah, so that volatility is like, what if I need that money tomorrow? I don't know what the price of Bitcoin is going to be tomorrow.
Exactly. And so, yeah, that aspect is going to take time. But I have talked to one business owner. She runs a salon in El Tunco, which is a beach town over there in El Salvador. But yeah, she created a little, investment plan for employees to put a portion of their salary into Bitcoin as a savings mechanism. So again, it's starting to spread. It's really early stages over there in El Salvador. I very much feel being there right now as kind of an early adopter in terms of Bitcoin and the circular economy, although there were the innovators over there, right? There's a city called Berlin, and that town is really, I think, at the center of the Bitcoin circular economy happening in El Salvador, right? I think that I don't know how many businesses they have over there, but it's a small town, and a large portion of the businesses over there accept Bitcoin. So you could basically spend Bitcoin for everything that you need in that town. And there's just a lot of people over there, working on the tools to build out the circular economy, and then they get to actually test it out. But in terms of a savings vehicle, going to your original question, I don't think it's as popular right now, but I think it will be if these initiatives continue to take hold, educating the people, and if Bitcoin continues to rise. But like I said, the volatility does scare people, and your point is absolutely correct. A lot of the Salvadoran population, I don't know how much, I don't know the stats on this, but a large part of them live on not a lot of money a month, right? Let's just put it like that. I heard something around $400 a month is the average El Salvadoran salary. I could be wrong on that, but it's somewhere around that. And so, yeah, if you need to make purchases to survive, and you need that money to maintain its value, it's the volatility in Bitcoin can be very scary, right? And so I think, like I said, I think that's only going to take time. When we look at what happened recently, right, and with the storms, we just had some storms over there in El Salvador, and prices rose on groceries. It really sent a shock throughout the system to the point where Bukele had to create a meeting or have a have a discussion on price gouging in that country. Now, I don't know the details to all of that. I can't comment as far as whether I think that's good or bad as far as his threats to the food industry over there, but it just goes to show you that how sensitive the El Salvadoran people are to price fluctuations. And so with Bitcoin and its volatile price, it's hard to convince the average El Salvadoran to save in it.
Yeah, actually, fun. So the employee savings plan thing could become, if that becomes like a model, more people might do it. Funny story on that. My first job, this is not a success story. This is a failure story. My first job in 2012, my first salary job, I'd done hourly jobs before that, but my first job where I got paid a salary, they had whatever their payroll software was. I don't even remember. It was probably one of the earliest adopters of making Bitcoin an option. So they said, when I joined, they said, oh, you can get paid partially in Bitcoin if you want. And this was 2012. So it would have been a great decision to say yes to any of that. I said, no, I didn't do it. First of all, I wasn't making enough, to your point about people not making enough to save, right? It was I was kind of basically breaking even off of what I have to pay for living expenses and all of that. So I didn't really have extra money to be able to say, oh, I'll take 10% in Bitcoin as investment. So I couldn't have done it, but B, it was so new at that point. I didn't trust it. I was like, oh, I don't know. Like, is this even going to be around? So I said no. But, if that was a possibility at that time, it's definitely like not a technical limitation for why people can't do that. It's more just, to your point, like people have to probably make enough money where they say, okay, I could afford to say 5%, 10%, and just leave that aside. And whatever the volatility is, so it's like a time horizon thing, right? At that point in my life, I didn't have enough money to have a long time horizon. It was just everything I made was basically going into living. And then, there was a saving was like an afterthought. So I think hopefully as like incomes rise, people start doing better, as these businesses start taking root in El Salvador, people can start thinking with that more long time horizon approach, and then actually putting that into savings.
I mean, think how hard it is to convince Americans, right, to do that, to take 5 or 10% of their savings and put it in Bitcoin, right? It's just it's just a challenge that it's going to take time to play out and for people to see the benefit and the value in saving in Bitcoin. It's just going to take time, especially when, I don't think America is a saving culture, and then also I think El Salvador is similar, just because people have lived day to day over there. And so saving, I don't think has been pretty much ingrained into the culture. And so that might change with Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin changes things. It's changing the trajectory of El Salvador. And, I think that the people are going to pick up on that, and it's going to benefit the country as a whole overall in the future.
Have you come across the book Layered Money by Nick Bhatia, or heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard of it. Absolutely. I haven't read it though.
Okay, yeah. So his theory in that book, I mean, it's a lot deeper than this. I'm not doing him justice by explaining it this way, but I'll give you like my understanding from it. So his thought is actually the opposite of Bitcoin becoming like long. This is like long time horizon, right? Like his thought is, hey, people might not transact day to day in this. He calls it like level 0 money, like base layer money. This is value, basically. His comparisons in that book are very much to gold. So there was a period of time where gold actually was used day to day and always has value. So if you hold gold, it's great. It's not a bad thing to hold gold. But then over time, these other currencies, paper currencies, were built on top of the gold. So the paper currencies were meant to represent gold, and it was backed by gold. And he thinks actually that is kind of where the future trajectory of Bitcoin might be, that the average citizen may not really realize they're transacting in Bitcoin, whatever ends up being the day-to-day transaction currency that they use, but it will be backed in Bitcoin. And I kind of wonder, like, for the average El Salvadorian, his point was like people didn't understand the value of gold, or the day-to-day value of gold, or the inconvenience of carrying that gold. Of course, Bitcoin actually solves a lot of that because you're not physically carrying around the Bitcoin. But his theory was that perhaps, the average citizen may not even realize it might become more of like a sovereign wealth thing. And the countries that adopt Bitcoin as their sort of reserve currency are going to be much better off and have like the tier 1 currencies of the future. Whereas, historically the dollar and the pound were the tier 1 currencies because you could at will exchange them for gold, which, we got away from in 1913. And, I want to do an episode on that for sure. The Fed and how all of that was created. But, I think that there's an interesting theory there too, that, maybe it is the average citizen isn't thinking about this. And maybe it is something that's like, one tier above. And the average citizens that do think about this, sure, they can hold Bitcoin and use Bitcoin. And that's actually a superior form of currency over the paper currency. But maybe the average citizen, it's like a layer below what they have to think about, because they're thinking about their grocery bill and their housing and their, gas and all of that stuff.
I think it's also more than that. So we had a conversation with a business owner, and we asked him about Bitcoin. He owned a restaurant on Lake Guatepeque, which is a beautiful lake over there in El Salvador. And we asked him whether he has any plans to accept Bitcoin. He kind of laughed it off, right? He's like, no, Bitcoin's not a thing here. And he goes, El Salvadoran people like cash, right? It took them a while to even accept credit cards over there, and still a lot of places don't. But Latin America, I think in general, likes the feel of cash. And so it's tangible, it's physical. right? They can, it's just easy to relate to it, right? And
India is the same way
so
for what, for what it's worth. India is exactly the same way.
yeah, and so I think this idea of Bitcoin banks, and I think what you're talking about there from Nick Bhatia's book also is something that Hal Finney might have talked about as well in one of his earlier posts, where he mentioned the idea of kind of Bitcoin banks, and then there being another layer of money which people transact with. And so I can see that happening definitely in El Salvador, especially if the legal structure is there to support it. I could definitely see some type of Bitcoin backed bank that offers physical notes for people to trade in, and that becoming a way in which El Salvadoran people use Bitcoin without knowing it. So, who knows? Who knows how all of this transpires? But it's definitely something to keep an eye on and see how it evolves. Be very interesting.
What is and this is like, truly like into the nitty gritty here. Like, what is the mechanism by which people spend their Bitcoin in El Salvador? Like, is it, it's probably Lightning wallets, right? But is there does El Salvador have their own Lightning wallet, or are they using like all the different Lightning wallets that exist, in sort of the open market today?
I think there's a Chivo wallet, which they developed. And, I don't know the specifics on that. But in general, people use, all types of Lightning wallets, Moon wallet, Phoenix wallet, Strike, and so forth. So, yeah, I think there's also BISC. Well, no, not BISC. BISC is the exchange. I forgot Blink wallet as well. And so, people are primarily transacting with Lightning, and it seems to be working great. I go to restaurants, I pay with Lightning, and so far haven't really had any issues.
It's awesome. And, I always think about like, whenever I think of mass adoption, I try to think about like, how easy would this be to explain to my mom, right? Like, how easy can I get her to use this, right? So I have her, she has some Bitcoin, but it's unfortunately on exchange, but it's like very, it's not easy to explain like the self-custody part, the Lightning part. How have you noticed, or is there any effort right now to like educate the average person, or are they having it kind of go peer to peer? Like, somebody explains it to somebody else, or someone adopts, then they tell their friends about it. Like, is there like a top down effort to educate, or is it purely peer to peer at this point?
I think it's a bottom up effort to educate. So there's Me Premier Bitcoin, which is I think doing a good job at Bitcoin education in like, I think basically the kids, right? They're educating the kids in school about Bitcoin and how to use Bitcoin.
Oh, wow, really? In schools?
Yeah. So
that's awesome.
It is awesome, and I think there's going to be more initiatives like that popping up. Like I said, there is a faction of the Bitcoin social layer, right? The revolutionaries that really want to see Bitcoin used to bring about a better world, a decentralized world, a world outside of fiat, and they're really driven by passion and to see that reality come about. And so, I think that people moving to El Salvador, they're coming there with their dreams and their hopes, and part of that is like a world built on Bitcoin. And so, there's initiatives I think that are going to be popping up to educate the youth growing up there on the value propositions of Bitcoin and how to use it, and also how to participate in the network, right? So there's that. And I forgot what your question was.
No, just around the education. Like you're saying it's a bottom up approach.
Yes.
Instead of just like, there's not really like a top down, it's more bottom up.
Yeah. So there's bottom up effort. So there's that. There's the educational effort. But then in general, there's Bitcoiners over there. And so, they'll approach business owners and they'll say, hey, listen, we want to, spend money at your business, but we want to pay in Bitcoin. And so naturally, an incentive to accept Bitcoin starts to emerge with all these local merchants. If enough people come by their shop and say, hey, we want to pay in Bitcoin, they might actually think about accepting it. So I think that's kind of how Bitcoin adoption also spreads, and education, because not only are they, like I said, the people over there are very passionate, and not only are they there to spend their Bitcoin, but they're also there to take time and educate people as well. So when someone goes to a local shop and they say, you know what, you're like the fifth person that's asked me to accept Bitcoin, we're going to accept Bitcoin. They take the time out to help them through the process of what they need to do to accept Bitcoin. And so again, I think the spread and the adoption of Bitcoin over there is primarily a bottom-up approach. The government has provided the legal structure for Bitcoiners to go over there and to build and transact in Bitcoin, and now it's just kind of up to the people to grow the network.
And I think like maybe there is over time, maybe like an opportunity for somebody to start a business that's like, we're going to make it easy to get you set up to accept Bitcoin. Like, an easy button, whether, whatever it is, like I think I always think about Shopify with this, right? Like it used to be very hard to create an e-commerce business back, 15 years ago. You had to create a whole website, you had to run a server, like all this stuff. Shopify comes in, they say, hey, you just pay us a monthly fee. We're going to make it super easy. You can accept payments. We'll handle all of that for you. The sales tax, everything that you have to think about, we'll take care of that. You just pay us a managed fee. There might be something similar like that for accepting Bitcoin. Like, just the business owner may not have the time, the, knowledge, the interest in learning about how to do this on their own. I think it's probably good to do it on your own. That's the beauty of Bitcoin. You can do it on your own. But maybe there's some service that can come along. And that's a business opportunity for somebody.
I'm sure
to come
that
in and make
exists
that really
already.
simple.
But yeah, I'm sure that exists already. And I think it's only going to continue, right? Like, I think that, as adoption grows over there, people are going to see the opportunities that exist to build businesses around that adoption. And part of that is going to be, services to onboard new businesses and even people, both educationally and with the technology. So yeah, that's definitely going to happen.
It's awesome.
It's getting, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, it's part of a initiative that we're focused on as well. Not probably specifically, to that, but like the idea of onboarding, onboarding businesses over there to be part of this like renaissance that's occurring. It's part of what I want to do and my partners want to do as well. And so we're exploring options for that as well. Like, if we're thinking about it, I can imagine other people are thinking about it as well too.
Excellent segue. So what are you have two businesses. I'd love to talk about those. So what are you working on, and where can people find more about those?
Yeah. So I like I originally said in my story, going to El Salvador, I went over there looking for opportunities on one of my trips, and I was posting about it on social media. So somebody reached out to me and they asked me if I wanted to open up a logistics business over there that they operate in Miami, and they've been looking to get into El Salvador. I don't know anything about logistics, but I went there and I saw his operation and I said, you know what, I can do this. So one of the, I guess, startups or businesses that I'm trying to get up off the ground over there is more traditional in the sense that it's a freight forwarding business, package forwarding business, where we're basically, facilitating the transfer of goods from the United States to El Salvador. There's a lot of people that need certain items. The United States is really like abundant in the convenience of, resources that we can acquire. Like Amazon is just crazy. I was just in El Salvador. I'm back in the States right now for a little bit, but I ordered an Amazon package and it was here a few hours later. And it's like, that's a little bit difficult to achieve over there in El Salvador. I would say access to goods and even services are still limited. Remember, this is a country that's been in the dark for, I don't know, let's say 4 decades, right? Between the Civil War and then the gang violence. But yeah, so access to certain goods are definitely needed. And so part of the company that I'm building is going to facilitate, goods coming into El Salvador. It's called Nakamoto Express. And so that's one of the projects I'm working on. It's more of a traditional business. But then there's also Sovereignty Studios. And Sovereignty Studios, we aim to be really part of the Renaissance, actually a leader in the Renaissance happening over there in El Salvador, right? We recognize that El Salvador is the first country to adopt Bitcoin, right? And as such, it's provided a foundation and a platform to build out this better world that Bitcoiners envision, right? A world built on sound principles, on sound values. And, Sovereignty Studios is a media company, but we also want to act as a liaison service for those interested in building in El Salvador. We want to help facilitate them to not only discover the opportunities that exist in El Salvador, but also offer them a opportunity to collaborate and network with other like-minded individuals. And then we also want to uplift different businesses and individuals who want to be part of this renaissance with our media services. So that's another project that we're working on. I'm working with my partner, Jordan Herbs. And we also, so that's one of the projects that we're working on that's really more geared towards being part of what's happening over there and actually helping out and providing value in that regard. Because, Bitcoin is interesting, right? It's a technology. It's also a financial system. But I also think of it as a social movement. And in order for Bitcoin adoption to spread, for the principles embedded in the actual system itself to reshape society, I think it requires human action, right? It's not going to happen on its own, right? Like, just because Bitcoin exists doesn't mean that the world is going to, is going to change just because of its existence. It's going to take people to actually utilize the technology, utilize it as money, and actually spread it through different initiatives. And so Sovereignty Studios is really looking to be part of that over there in El Salvador, and broadcast that out to the world as well. Like, we want El Salvador to be an example for the rest of the world to follow. Kind of going back to our initial conversation that we had, where we were discussing how El Salvador could, lead other nations to adopt similar policies. We want to highlight that through our media services as well. So, we're just in the building phase. We just basically got our little headquarters over there. It's very much of a startup feel happening, but we're building, and we're really looking forward to, the future over there, because that's a country that's on the rise. First of all, now that it's built a safe foundation for people to build on, and I think their politics is on the rise, and I think that their economy is on the rise, and the money that they're using is on the rise as well. So, all these factors really create a bright future in my mind for El Salvador. And so to be there on the ground and to be able to be part of that is something that, me and my partners want to be a part of. And we're doing that through Sovereignty Studios.
That's awesome. Where can people go if they want to read more or learn more about what you're working on?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. You can find me at SOV Mindset. And then you can also go to sovereigntystudios.com. You can sign up to our newsletter, buildinelsalvador.com. And then I think that's it. That's pretty much where you can find us.
Awesome. So I'm going to link to all of that in the show notes. Michael, this has been amazing. We should do a part 2 in a few months or a year, see the progress, and who knows, maybe we do the next one in El Salvador. So I'm itching to go.
Are you? So yeah, let me ask you, what's your interest in El Salvador?
I think it's just such a great model, right? It's like somebody had to be the lab and be the first to go and see what, of course, the safety thing I almost think is like a base layer part of the conversation, but it is related, right? It's like kind of ties back to Bitcoin. Like, you can't have that long time horizon without having that safety. But it's like, now that you have that safety, now you've implemented Bitcoin as legal tender. what happens next, right? Like somebody had to run this experiment first to be the model for everybody else. And I think as Bitcoiners, like, sure, we have our own mythology. We have our own, like, hey, this is the utopian vision for what the world is going to be like. But I really like that point you made about it's going to be built by people, right? And so people have to go and do it. And then more people will see that example and go do it elsewhere. So to me, it's like great. It's almost like a experiment or research lab that somebody is doing that's like, hey, here's what happens when you actually build a society on top of this. And here's the results we're going to get. And it's, by the way, it's very public. Anyone can come and see the results for themselves on the ground. I think it's just such an inspiring model because, again, it's like we have this vision of what the world will look like in a Bitcoin world. And it's like, it's great to have that on Twitter and on paper and books and stuff like that. It doesn't mean anything until you can do it in the real world. So to me, that's the exciting part. And it's like, wow, someone's actually doing this. And I want to see the results firsthand for myself. So that's kind of what my interest has been. And it's just, that's why I've been keeping a close tab on like kind of what's happening there. Cause, you know, I do think like, I fully believe in the mythology. Like, I think it can actually really, really improve the world, but it's like, we got to see the results. And then people aren't going to do it unless they're Bitcoiners already. They're not even going to think it's a possibility. And the way you prove to the average person is, hey, here's how here's what doing this has done to improve people's lives. And here's the real life results of that, right? It's not just like in a book somewhere or on a Twitter thread. It's real life. Like, these are the A to B results that we've seen. This is why you should do it too. And I think that is, to me, like the most powerful thing. It's way more powerful than writing like another theoretical book about Bitcoin. Like, it's great. Those books are great. Big fan of, Bitcoin Standard and all these great books that have been written. Nothing wrong with those. But nothing's going to change until people actually do stuff in real life. So to me, that's the exciting part.
Yeah. And that's exactly, going back to Sovereignty Studios, that's exactly what we want to broadcast and highlight, right? It's like if El Salvador is going to be an example for the rest of the world to follow, right? The rest of the world needs to hear about it. And so we're over there highlighting the transformation that's occurring. And not only that, but for those that are interested in joining, right, we want to facilitate them to be part of the renaissance that's happening over there, right? El Salvador is still very much raw, and it comes with a lot of challenges and inconveniences. The infrastructure needs to be built up over there. It's not it's a paradise, but it's not an easy, like I said, convenient life just yet. And so I think that attracts builders. It attracts pioneers, people who see the potential and the future over there. And so, we want to make that transition for those people as easy as possible. That's one of our initiatives, right? And then we want to bring like-minded people together to collaborate, because I've already seen the power of that. When you get all these people, smart people, driven people, motivated people, entrepreneurial-minded people in one place, right? That mishmash of ideas it only takes a little bit of time for that to actually turn into, action, right? And so we want to help bring people like that together as well, so they can build the future over there. So it's like you said, this renaissance doesn't happen by, in my opinion, doesn't happen by just stacking sats. It's like we actually have to, take action and build it out.
Yeah, otherwise we all just have like Beanie Babies, basically, just little collectibles. Otherwise, unless people are actually using it and doing something with it. So exactly. What's the point, right? Otherwise. So that's my interest in it. And yeah, that's why it's just been fascinating. I think, highlighting those stories is going to be so important. I think attracting those builders, people won't know this opportunity exists unless people share those stories. So it's awesome, what you guys are doing. And I think, there's probably a lot of opportunity for people to come in and build, and even just to like build up those, to your point about Amazon, few hours delivery, like even just those like first world luxuries, like just building those back up, in a country like that. I mean, those are still going to take people doing work to make that stuff happen. So there's probably so much opportunity just in terms of even just, it doesn't have to be Bitcoin related directly. There's probably all these ancillary things that are equally, important.
El Salvador is the land of opportunity the way I see it, right? If you got a dream, if you got a vision, bring it to El Salvador, right? Like, I think that's fertile ground for for building out whatever you aspire to build out, because it's just, it's the land of opportunity right now. There's so many things that are needed over there. And from what I can tell, Bukele has made the call. He went on the Miss Universe pageant and said, "Wait, we're looking for the best and brightest minds to help us build, our vision for the future." And so the opportunity is there. If you're a pioneer or entrepreneur and you want to be part of something amazing, right? El Salvador could potentially change the trajectory of humanity, right? Because if what they do is successful, people will emulate 100%. And so, to be a part of that, to be at the forefront, right? To be the spearhead of that transformation, for me, is very fulfilling, right? And I'm happy to be there right now, and I'm happy to help anyone else that wants to come down there and join.
Last question, then I'll let you go. This is a very tactical question. Like, what is the visa situation for, let's say, an American trying to go down there? Like, do you need to apply for a visa? Do you just show up? Is it visa-free entry? Like, what do they do in terms of, I guess, not letting just anybody in, or do they let everyone in right now? Like, what's the situation there?
I'm on a tourist visa, and I'm going to be applying for my residency soon. I don't know what's required, but I know that there's all these services out there that will help you. As interest starts to grow in El Salvador, especially, over the last 3 months, I would say interest in El Salvador has just skyrocketed. It started with Bukele going to CPAC, then, his inauguration brought Tucker over here. It brought, Donald Trump Jr. to El Salvador. Now there's like El Salvador caucus being built in the United States, right? Or in Congress. It's just, so El Salvador is now, I think, really becoming, an interest in people's minds. It's definitely being put on the map. And so I think that as more people look to El Salvador as a potential, place to either build a life or have some type of presence, all these services are going to pop up that are going to help facilitate that. And I don't have the details as far as what is required for you to get a visa or citizenship and so forth. But I know that there are services out there that facilitate that and make it easy. So, but I'm on a tourist visa, and like I said, I'll be applying for residency. And so maybe I'll go through that process and, again, probably create some type of content around that to help others who want to go through similar steps.
Yep. Yeah, because I'm sure a lot of people, when they're sold, then they're like, all right, well, how do I actually become a part of this? So probably that's a good piece of content there for you guys to create.
Yeah. Like I said, even within, now thinking about it, even within, my little social media bubble, the amount of inbound traffic that I'm getting of people interested in El Salvador is just through the roof. It's off the charts. And I use that kind of as a gauge as far as like what's happening with the interest out there. And so, yeah, I think that very much so, especially as we continue to see what's happening in the United States. I don't know what the elections are going to do, but we see what's happening in Europe and so forth. Like, I think that El Salvador is just going to continue to attract, people wanting a different way of life. And so, yeah, it's interesting. I think the future is bright over there.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on and spending some time here. It's been fascinating. I think everyone has a lot to think about. I'm going to put a lot of these links we've talked about in the show notes so people can check that out there. I'll put your Twitter account there. It seems to be the best place to get in touch with you, your newsletter link. Do you still do the Substack or no?
No, I don't do the Substack anymore. Everything's primarily right now through the newsletter. But
cool. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Michael. We'll definitely be having more conversations about this in the future.
Neil, man, thank you so much for having me on. It was a great conversation. And it was good talking to you.